Welcome to Casual Friday. So first I want to update you on my Edwardian sweater, which has been in a timeout for the past month or so. I'm going to talk a little bit about books in a couple of different ways. I'm going to show you a birthday present I got from my sister-in-law that's yarn related that I'm excited about. And then I want to spend some time talking about a topic that came up on Ravelry this week on inclusiveness, disabilities, and ableism, because reading through that discussion has really taught me a lot, and I am going to make a change on my podcast going forward that hopefully won't be super noticeable, but will have an impact. So let's get started. It was my birthday on Sunday, and my sister-in-law got me a yarn bowl, which I have never had a yarn bowl before. And but it's really pretty. This one is made of metal, and it's red, which is my favorite color. And it has some little holes in the front where I suppose you could string two different strands through if you're trying to keep them separated, perhaps. But it's probably going to be mostly decorative for me, although I do, because I tend to have my yarn wound in cakes and they tend to sit on flat surfaces. But if I'm honest with myself, my desk doesn't have very many flat surfaces, and often even as I'm working, the ball might fall to the floor, and I have a very tall desk and therefore a very tall desk chair, and so reaching down to pick them up is a little problem. So I'm going to see if this is going to help prevent me from having to actually get up out of my chair or get the back scratcher that I have somewhere buried on my desk to reach down and pick those balls of yarn up when they fall off. So we'll see. But so this is really pretty. I've seen a lot of yarn balls, like or yarn bowls on the internet, that sometimes they have funny faces, or sometimes they're made out of wood, and sometimes they're made out of other ceramic materials. I had never seen one that was made of metal, but again, I'd never gone looking for them. So I thought that was a really neat thing. I'd be interested to know if any of you who use yarn bowls actually find them practical, if they're more of a decorative item for you. Last week I showed you this book called Saltwater Mittens, and it's a collection of mittens from Newfoundland in Canada, and it's related to the mittens I've been working on in the past few weeks. And somebody mentioned in the comments that there was an interview, or that there was a story about this book and the women who wrote it on the radio. And I think maybe it had been on the radio back in December when the book came out. I'm not completely sure, but there was a link. She left a link to the story and said, where it started in the broadcast. And it was really interesting. It was a nice long story. It would be comparable to a story you'd hear on Weekend Edition on NPR here in the United States. So I'm assuming this is like Canadian Broadcasting Corporation or something, but it's a similar length story. It's probably 15 minutes long, and you can really hear the accents of the people and hear a lot about these mittens that figure predominantly in this book, which are called trigger mittens. And they're mittens that have three fingers. The hand of the mitten is for three of the fingers, and then there's a separate forefinger and a separate thumb. And originally the idea was that you could, shoot a gun for hunting or whatever, but it also allows fishermen or anybody working out of doors to have the ability to use these forefinger and thumb. And they're really a common sight, or in the past had been a really common sight on Newfoundland. And so the story is about those mittens and about this book and the women who wrote it. So I'm going to leave a link down below in case you're interested, because I thought it was a great story. I have a couple other things to talk about with just books. I did go back to the Textile Center. I had wanted to check out some books that were new to the Knitters Guild, just to see what the Guild had bought, what was new in books that maybe I wasn't specifically looking for, and just to see what books might be out there that might be interesting. So I've checked out two. I haven't looked through them yet, so I'll report on these next week. One of them is, this one is by Jorid Lindvik, and it's called The Big Book of Knitted Socks. And they appear to be mostly stranded colorwork socks. So I'll be interested to see what these look like. I've knit tons of socks, but I have never actually knit stranded colorwork socks. So I'd be curious to see what might be in here in terms of the reference section, and if they have specific tips for socks and stranded colorwork, because the amount of stretch that you have in a stranded sock is not going to be the same as with other stitch patterns. And then the other book I got was called The Art of Lithuanian Knitting. It's 25 traditional patterns, but it's also the people, places, and history that inspire them. And that is always what appeals to me in a book, is when there's reference material either about the history of this tradition or information about what specifically makes this Lithuanian versus some of the Latvian things. So a quick look through there, I can see some similarities between Latvian mittens and Lithuanian mittens, which isn't surprising considering their proximity, but definitely I see some differences just on the surface, and I do not have a trained eye for either Latvian or Lithuanian knitting at all. So I'll be interested in seeing and learning something more about this, and I'll report back to you. The other thing I wanted to mention was I had pulled out one of my stitch dictionaries. It's probably I think it's the newest one I purchased. It's the Charted Knitting Designs. It's one of Barbara Walker's treasuries. She had 3 or 4 treasuries. This is the third one. And I have the first and second, and then I have other stitch dictionaries as well. And as I was putting this away next to my other stitch dictionaries, I realized I have not done with this book what I have done with my other stitch dictionaries, and it's something that I find to be incredibly useful, particularly for stitch dictionaries, but sometimes for my other books as well. And that is, I have taken them to a copy place. Like we have here in the States, we have a place called Kinko's, but they were bought out by FedEx. I think it's still FedEx Kinko's. So if you need to get copies made of things or booklets made up or something like that, you can go there. But what you can also do, they can make booklets, but they can also cut off the spine of a book and then add one of these spiral ring bindings. And I really like that because I can do 2 things. One is I can lay the book flat and it will just lay on the table, or I can do this so it doesn't take up as much room. And I just find it so helpful for my stitch dictionary. So I've done the other treasuries, and I've done my old out-of-print Harmony guide that way. And I think I have I have a book up here. It says Cookie's Sock Innovation Book, and I did the same thing with that because I was, I think this is the one that has a really good reference section at the beginning. And it was just, I had this book out a lot, and I found it very handy to be able to lay it flat like that. Now, I don't do this on all of my books. I just do it on the books that I tend to use a lot, particularly books that I use as reference sources, and stitch dictionaries certainly fall into that category. So in February, as you probably know, I spent it doing what I call Finish It February, trying to get as many of my unfinished projects off my plate as I could. Doesn't mean I actually finished them. It just means I evaluate them. And is this something that is worth pursuing? Have I gotten everything out of this project that I wanted to? And am I going to just put it in my stash and have it available as stash yarn, or do I actually want to complete it or not? So I went through a lot of my things that I actually wanted to have, and I finished them. And then I made those mittens, and then I was sitting here thinking, what am I going to work on next? I have the Edwardian sweater that I was planning several months ago, but it's coming along into spring, and I sometimes have a hard time knitting a sweater in the summer. if I'm not going to be able to wear it right away. So a lot of times I kind of time how I'm knitting sweaters based on if I'm going to get it done in time to be able to wear it right away, or is this something that I know is going to take me longer than the 3 weeks that I usually can stand working on a project. It's going to take longer than that, so I can work on it now and then put it to the side and then finish it in the fall. So I'm kind of at that point with my Aran sweater, and it's a big project. But I'm also going to be traveling quite a bit in April, and I've been thinking about what do I want to take with me, what would be good travel projects for me, because one of the trips is a road trip. I'm going to Kansas City to Ply Away, which is a conference, like a retreat for spinning. And I've been practicing my spinning again. I hadn't been doing any spinning for a while, so I've been practicing that and getting ready for this trip. And it's a long drive. I think it's 8-hour drive maybe from here in Minnesota. And I'm going with another person. So, and we're going to share a hotel room and things like that to help cut costs. So I have that kind of knitting to think about. I also have a trip to the Netherlands planned to go visit my daughter who's living there for a year. And so we have an airplane flight, a long flight, and then a stay there, and what is reasonable to be carrying around with me for that kind of distance, and that I can attend to, whether we're on a train or just waiting for something in line or whatever. So I'm thinking about these like, what am I going to be doing next? And in the meantime, though, I had a project that I'd been working on a long time, and then I put to the side because I'd gotten frustrated with it. So you might recognize this. This is the Edwardian Sweater that I started right after Christmas, and I worked on week after week. I got all the knitting done, and then I realized the cuffs, the sleeve cuffs and the neck, I had knit at too tight a gauge, and I was going to have to rip them out and re-knit the cuffs and the neck. And I was just... I just couldn't do it at the time, so I put it to the side. So this week I re-knit the sleeve cuffs, and I did re-knit the neck. I haven't sewn it on yet, which is why it's not on here. And what I've done so far is, I've sewn up this sleeve, so this is now in a tube, and I've sewn the side seam on this side. I haven't done the other yet. And now I'm trying to figure out how I want to approach seaming this sleeve into this armhole. So there's a couple of issues. One, this is a set-in sleeve, so there's some shaping to this that has to be considered. But because this is an Edwardian era garment, it has kind of puffy sleeves, and then we have this kind of accordion fabric to deal with. So I'm just trying to figure out the best way. The sleeve cap is much larger than the armhole, and that's because it's to create this fullness of the arm that they had back in the Edwardian era. So that's why I'm trying to consider how I'm going to do this. For the normal set-in sleeve that I was going to seam in, I would use a mattress stitch, and I would just, and for most of the sleeve, it would be catching one stitch on one side and then one stitch on the other, back and forth. But there are a lot more stitches on the sleeve side than there are on the armhole side. And so I want to keep this sort of accordion fabric vertical, and I want to be able to ease in all of the extra fabric. So I've been thinking of a couple of solutions. One of them is that I would not use mattress stitch, but instead I would maybe use back stitch, because I thought it's bulkier seam, but this is a bulkier sleeve that might just need that extra support that back stitch could provide. So that's one thought. And the other thought is that I could still do mattress stitch because I'm still seaming two vertical edges together. But what I might be doing is one stitch on the armhole side for, one row on the armhole side for every 2 rows on the sleeve. So I think I might count up the number of rows that I actually have for the sleeve cap and then how many I have for the armhole, and see if I can look at what the ratio is and if there's a way to make that work. Just thinking about it and trying to figure it out. So once I get that one figured out, then I can do the other side. And then the next step is going to be figuring out, I'm going to have some of the same issues with the ribbing for the neck because of how much extra fabric there is here. So again, trying to figure out how to ease in all this extra fabric but still keep the accordion nature of this. That's the thing I'm puzzling about and trying to figure out. So I'm still working on this, and I'm hoping that I can figure these things out and get it done. And while I'm doing that, I'll think about what I'm going to be knitting on my journeys over the next month. I had a question in the comments asking me if I had ever felted a sweater in the wash, like accidentally felted it, not on purpose. The answer is no, I never have. And the person who had asked the question thought, oh, I thought maybe that was the case. And she explained that she had felted a sweater and she cried. She's so upset. And I can totally understand that feeling. So I was thinking, and she said it was a superwash sweater and she trusted it and she put it in the wash and it felted. And so that was like, oh, that's an interesting, I hadn't even thought that was the problem because I thought, well, I've never felted a sweater because I don't put my sweaters in the laundry bin with the other laundry. It's always kept separate. So I never have that problem of, oh, it accidentally gets thrown in with the jeans or whatever and it gets washed and felted. That wasn't the problem. The problem was, knowing that I'm washing this sweater and it says that can be machine washed, and it ended up felting. So I thought about all of the sweaters that I have knit for myself, and they are all made with regular non-superwash wool. It's just my preference for knitting. I have knit some superwash sweaters. One for my daughter, she was going to wear it, it was a higher neck and she's got sensitive skin. I wanted to make sure it was superwash merino to make it as the least amount of itch possible for her. And I don't know if she's ever washed it and what happened to it. I've also made some baby sweaters using superwash wool, and I usually just include some washing instructions, gentle cycle like with underwear and lay it flat. And I've hoped for the best. I don't count sweaters made from like sock yarn, like that's combination superwash wool and nylon. I never worry about that because I throw my socks in the wash every week and don't worry about them. But because so many of my socks are made with superwash wool and nylon, I have felted a few pairs of socks inadvertently that were made from apparently non-superwash wool or alpaca, or it had mohair in them, and they'd be fine for a while, and then all of a sudden I would notice they're getting tighter and tighter and tighter. And I think and I've stopped using those yarns not because I think they're bad, but because I don't think about it when I'm throwing them in the wash. I don't think about, oh, these particular socks are different. I just don't think about it. And so I try to prevent any felting from happening in the future by making sure that the yarns I use for my socks are really fine in the washing machine. So I haven't done that, but I know how heartbreaking it would be, but a lot of it just has to do with everyone in this house does their own laundry, so I don't have to worry about somebody else accidentally washing one of my sweaters. And because I know they have to be hand washed and they can't be machine washed, that's another reason I probably have never felted a sweater. Oh, wait. I just remembered when I was living in New Zealand, I had only been knitting for a couple of years, and I was working for 6 months. And during that time, I knit myself a sweater. And what I did was I adapted a man's sweater. It was like going to be too long for me, but it was kind of roomy around. So it ended up being kind of a short, a little bit too roomy sweater, but it had cables on it. And when I was done working, when my 6 months were up, and I was just going from, youth hostel to youth hostel every few days, I was in Arthur's Pass on the South Island, and a bunch of us were going to do laundry. And I was trying, it was the first sweater for myself, I think, adult sweater. I'd knit a lot of baby sweaters and all kinds of things. I think this was the first adult sweater I had knit for myself that I needed to wash because it got really grimy. And I was with some other people and they told me, oh, sure, you can throw those in the wash. And I'm like, really? Like, because it's wool. And these were like Europeans and I had never done it. They're like, oh yeah, we throw our wool sweaters in the wash all the time. And I did that and it got a lot shorter. I no longer have that sweater. I think I kept it until I moved back here and then I probably got rid of it. So I have felted a sweater and it was accidentally, but on purpose. Like I intentionally put it in this washing machine thinking that those who knew better were correct. So I have felted a sweater. When I started recording these Casual Friday videos, I didn't really know what they were going to be. I had been doing technique videos for a year and I knew I wanted to continue those. Those videos are very focused on specific technique or a group of techniques that are related and how to use them, why they work, how they work, when you might want to use them, when they might not work as well. But they're very focused on technique. And I felt like I had more to say about knitting than what I was doing in my technique videos. And yet I didn't feel like a technique video was the place for me to chat about other things. So I had an idea that, well, maybe I could do a second video every week in which I talk about knitting related things, but I'm not necessarily teaching a technique. I mean, I do sometimes teach things or explain things or talk about how things work, but I'm not teaching a directed technique video. And I also talk about a lot of other things. And sometimes they're very barely connected to knitting, but other times they're very directly connected. And sometimes, they're historical things, whether it's, my own family history or it's about knitting history or it somehow combines the two. But I just try to bring things in that I'm learning about or that I'm wondering about or that I'm struggling with and share those with you here. And so I was not thinking that this was a podcast. I didn't know what it was. And while I do sometimes listen to or watch podcasts, they aren't knitting related. And so when I first started doing this, I did kind of look around and see, well, what are other people doing? But I didn't really know what I was looking for. And I didn't really care so much what other people were doing because I was concerned with what I wanted to do and what I thought would be interesting rather than trying to figure out what somebody else would think was interesting. And I felt like over time I would kind of figure out what Casual Friday was. So it wasn't until somebody said, oh, I really like your podcasts, that it ever occurred to me that that's what this maybe could be called. And so I do refer to it now as a podcast style video as opposed to my technique videos. And I do, listen to what people say that they enjoy about my videos and keep that in mind when I'm thinking about other ideas. But ultimately, I'm just mostly thinking about what am I interested in this week, and then share it with you. This week on Ravelry, in the forums, specifically in the forum that's called For the Love of Ravelry, that's the forum that's aimed at discussions surrounding Ravelry itself. Whether you have a question about how Ravelry works, or if you have a bug, like you found a bug, like something's not working correctly, then you want to report it, or you want to request a new feature or something like that. Just discussion about Ravelry itself. So Wednesday morning, I noticed there was a thread I hadn't seen before in For the Love of Ravelry, and it was about knitters with disabilities and invisibility, and ableism was, I think, the name of the topic. And the poster, the person who originally posted, it was a fairly brief post. And she just wanted to bring up for discussion, similarly to how other marginalized groups have had discussions online in the past few years, just to bring awareness about their situation and to try to see if some change could come about. These kinds of discussions, one of the things I've learned about them is that when the discussion is open, the people who are reading about it who are not sort of members of the marginalized group need to keep their mouths shut and listen. And then they can ask questions for more clarity. But it is not their position to just step in and say, well, either minimize or dismiss the concern that the person has brought up, or to deny that it exists. But you also shouldn't step in and say, well, I have the solution to your problem and it's such and such. Because if you haven't lived this experience and this is the first time it's been brought to your attention, you don't really know the entire story. If someone has posted something that's quite short, you have no context. And so you really don't have any business stating what you think the solution to the problem should be. So it really takes a lot of listening and communication on both sides to sort of explain the position that the marginalized group has, and for other people to listen to it and then get some clarification and then ask how they can help. Like, how can I help? And what can I do? And can you clarify, is this what you mean? And that sort of thing. So I knew that going into this. Because I didn't see this thread until Wednesday morning and it had started on Tuesday, there were close to 200 posts by the time I got to it. So before I ever post in a thread, I don't always follow this, but in most cases, before I post in a thread, I want to see what everyone else has said in case somebody already says what I would think to say. And also just to get, to see how the conversation has evolved. And then, do I have anything to add to it after that? So I was reading through, well, let me tell you what the original post was, is that there are a huge number of Ravelers who have a disability, chronic illness, are neurodiverse, and we are still invisible despite people's worlds getting bigger. And so there were 3 bullet points that she had, and these are short, so it's not telling the whole story. It's just bringing these issues to the table. Accessible clothing for pumps, ports, bags is still limited. Disabled models are practically non-existent. Productivity and output are still focused on in the podcasting community. So the first 2 things I thought I understood, and I sort of had a response to in my head and wanted to see what other people were saying. But the third one, the one about productivity and output are still focused on in the podcasting community, was one where I thought, I want to understand that one better because I have this podcast. So I read through, I think there were 190 posts by then. I read through all of them, and the first 2 issues were discussed a lot, and it really opened my eyes because and I think that this post may have been edited to make it clearer what was being asked, because I think originally it was a request for more designs. There aren't enough designs for accessible clothing. And so I was reading it as designers should be doing this. It's just saying that accessible clothing is difficult. This is an issue that we have. It's difficult to have clothing that's accessible for pumps or whatever. So this third one about productivity and output are still focused on in the podcast community is one that I didn't understand. And so I read through all of the posts and it hadn't really gotten addressed. The first 2 topics had gotten addressed. So, but I really asked about what this podcasting thing meant. And so I asked, I said, what are you actually getting out? Because I do a weekly podcast and I want to know what I might be missing or what I could do differently to address this. In my head, I thought I understood what she was saying. In my head, I thought she was saying that podcasts focus on, look how many things I finished this week. and that it was maybe sort of a one-upmanship thing or a source of pride to finish a ton of things and show them every week in a podcast. But I don't watch a lot of podcasts. Occasionally I watch one here, one there, but I really don't know what other podcasters are doing. And I know that personally, I'm not finishing a bunch of things. Finish It February was a little different thing where these are all works in progress and I was trying to get them off my plate. And some of getting them off my plate was just saying, you're done, even though you're not finished. So I was trying, and it's such a small part. Like the beginning of my podcast is when I talk about what I'm working on and what I maybe have finished that week. But it's a very short part, and then I'm on to talking about other things. So I was trying to understand what that meant. Is that what she was getting at? Is that how other podcasts are? And so I asked, so her response was this: it's little things really, apologizing for having the same projects, for not having FOs, finished objects, that sort of thing. And at first I thought, well, that's the exact opposite of what I thought she meant. Instead of saying, look how many things I finished, you're saying that people are apologizing for not having finished things. And so I had to think about this some more, and I realized it's really two sides of the same thing, which is that productivity, producing, seems to be the point. And so if a podcaster hasn't produced something, then they tend to apologize, or they apologize. It's like, I'm sorry, I haven't finished anything. It's the same thing that I showed you last week, type of thing. And that I understood a little bit. I don't think I do that a lot, but I have done it recently. And it was when I started working on mittens and I got really interested in those Maine mittens. I was reading the books and studying the patterns, and I decided to knit one of those mittens, and I got one mitten done. So when I was preparing for Casual Friday, I was like, okay, well, what did I do this week? Because that's part of what I'm showing you is what did I do? And I was like, oh, I've got one mitten. And so I showed the mitten. And then last Friday, when I was thinking about Casual Friday, I saw that the second mitten was almost done, but the thumb wasn't. And I made a conscious decision to finish that mitten before Casual Friday so that I would have something finished to show you, that I would have a product to show you. And I spent last week talking about how people, non-knitters, look at our knitting as producing products while we think of it as a process, and that they can't see our process. All they can see is our product. And that's why they think either we're wasting our time or they think we should sell them. So I just thought about that. Was really interesting because when I'm doing a podcast, I'm trying to produce content. So I'm thinking about what can I show you? What can I tell you about? And I do sometimes push myself to finish something in order to have something to show on the Friday video. So what she's saying in this, because I confirmed, I'm like, is this what you're saying? Are you saying that sort of there's this societal culture that being productive is a virtue, and that if we have, and that people with disabilities are maybe feel that more heavily, that they aren't as productive, whatever productive means. And so by apologizing for not having been productive, so that we're just feeding that same idea to ourselves, that it's important to be productive, and that if we haven't been productive, we need to apologize for it. This discussion gave me some perspective on something that used to happen years ago when I was in a writers group, and we would have these, it was like a local chapter of a national organization, so there were probably 130 people in the local chapter, and we would have these monthly challenges that we called Book in a Week. And you didn't have to write a book in a week. It's impossible, really. But the idea was to challenge ourselves, like push ourselves for that week and nobody was required to sign up. This is totally voluntary. Like if you feel like, you really want to push on something, like maybe you want to finish a book, or maybe you want to get started on a book, or maybe you haven't been writing much lately and you want to just make sure that you're actually writing, 10 pages for the week, or something like that. A lot of people would set a goal of 100 pages for the week or 50 pages for the week. The idea was it was a stretch. And we had a rule that we had to institute after a while, which was you cannot talk about why you didn't write. If you didn't write, because we would do a daily check, it would be for a week, and we'd check in daily. The idea was that you weren't alone in your writing, because it's such a solitary activity, that you just check in with people, and then when you actually did accomplish something, you had somebody to cheer you on. Whatever your goal was, if you met your goal and you wanted to tell people about it, you could, and there would be people who would be happy for you. Whatever your goal was, it didn't matter. But the rule was you couldn't check in by explaining all the reasons why you couldn't write. And it drove me crazy, because some of these emails would be really long. That is a really long email that had to take them 20 to 30 minutes to write that email, explaining to us why they didn't write. And they could have just spent 20 minutes writing, and then checked in and said, I wrote a page, or I wrote half a page, or whatever. Instead, they spent all of that sort of energy doing that. And that was my perspective on what they were doing. But in light of this other conversation that's going on Ravelry, what I see is that they had internalized this, like, I'm supposed to be producing something. And so I'm going to tell them what I produced. I'm going to show them how productive I was. My dog was sick, and my car broke down, and the dishwasher exploded, and my boss had this urgent thing that he didn't tell me about until 4:30 in the afternoon. So here are all the ways that I was productive, which is why I couldn't produce writing. So that just gave me a different perspective on what was going on back then, and it would give me a different way to explain to people, if I were to do something like that now, like why we don't want to hear excuses. Like, it doesn't matter if you wrote or not. Just, you don't even have to check in, but if you want to check in, we're not going to judge you for not having written. You don't need to explain why you weren't productive. It doesn't matter. So when I realized that, I had apologized a couple of weeks ago when I only had one mitten, I said, well, I had to write an article, and I was doing a lot of reading, and I was apologizing for only having one mitten to show you. I'm not going to do that anymore. But it was because of that, and kind of shifting my thinking about what I was doing by apologizing, that I realized the second point that the person had made, which is about models, which was disabled models are practically non-existent. Now, I totally support, all sorts of models in knitwear, but my feeling was, there's nothing I can do about that, because I am a tiny, small designer. I don't hire models. So, but I thought, that's something that magazines and book publishers and bigger designers who were doing, larger collections of things, that's certainly something that they should keep in mind, and to have as diverse a group of models as they could have. But once I realized that I was apologizing for not being productive, I started thinking a little bit more about, I'm just modeling my own stuff, so, whatever. And then I thought, that's not always true. A few years ago, I had made a couple of hats that I wanted modeled, and I wanted my daughters to model them because they had long hair, and I thought, hats only look good on beautiful young girls with long hair would be much preferable to me, who has no hair and is in her 50s, and when I wear a hat, I look terrible. So I had bought into the idea that, there's a better model than what I could do. Nobody wants to see me wearing a hat, was kind of how I was thinking about it. Because I do look at hats that are modeled by young people, and I think, would that look good on me? I don't know if that would look good on me. So I would be curious to hear if any of you have noticed this tendency to apologize for a lack of productivity. If you've noticed it just in general, or if you've noticed it on podcasts in particular, and what your thoughts are on that, and how maybe it's made you feel. But I really would encourage you to read through the thread on Ravelry. I'll leave a link down below. That's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video, or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below, or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.